Hi, and welcome to Marketing Optimization Without Designs. I am your host, Alex Harris, and today we have Ginn here today. Ginn is the project manager of growth at StumbleUpon. How you doing?
Oh, doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Aaron, why don't you just tell us how you got started doing optimization at StumbleUpon and what you do there?
So originally, I got my work or started my career in optimization work whenever I joined a company and it was about to go under, and I didn't know when I joined, and sort of trial by fire, and we had to make things work very quickly and very effectively. And out of that, I learned a lot of techniques that encourage you to invest resources properly and to work on the right sort of things. And before I worked at StumbleUpon, I worked for the Romney campaign doing similar work, and they recruited me off of the campaign towards the end, and I moved back out to San Francisco like about a week after the election. So at StumbleUpon, they really needed a lot of work in developing lean processes, figuring out how to actually run Scrum, focusing like how you actually make good product decisions. So I spent a lot of time on that before I actually went into the optimization work. StumbleUpon, a lot of our optimization work is focusing on new user experiences, visitor landing pages, that sort of stuff, and then eventually moved into the core product experiences to start working on retention, because the key delineating factor about optimization work is feedback loop, feedback time. Mm-hmm. To accomplish your goal, whether it's retention or acquisition. So product-related optimizations tend to be quite long. Thus, basically your iteration cycles is extended, versus acquisition and marketing-oriented optimizations are very quick and very fast. And you can find learnings and lessons that are validated by statistical evidence that that you're actually working on the right thing.
Awesome. I've been following StumbleUpon forever. It seems like it's grown, but still stayed the core of what it is. So do you find essentially the areas that, I guess, the templates that are the most popular, and you focus on your optimization practices on those areas? How does that kind of work, where you pick and choose where to test?
So we run a model they call a visitor model that determines the highest ROI across our service for acquisition related stuff. So typically what marketing people oriented or focus on is either acquisition or sort of engagement emails. Right. So for acquisition, we have a model that tells us how many visitors are coming, what's their conversion rate, how many users a day we're generating from there, and the previous work and optimization that we've done in that space to show sort of ROI about what's the sort of payoff of hours we put in versus output. That model is our guiding light about where do we go from here and what should we invest in next. For marketing oriented emails, we typically have a data science model that says when's the likely point that people will not retain or not engage, or we're trying to push some sort of reactivation metric. We heavily use data science to determine when do we actually send emails. And what area of the product will have the highest ROI. Awesome.
And when you talk about data science, it's essentially you're trying to figure out the behaviors of the different users and their different buying modes. Is that what you mean by data science?
Yeah. So instead of buying modes, it'd be stumbling or
right.
Content. So data science, we at StumbleUpon works on very simple stuff, as in let's generate a model about visitors, to very complicated things like what is in the first session. What type of signals determine the likelihood that someone's going to retain and not retain?
Oh, wow.
So our data science team is a mix-up of engineers, data engineers, data scientists, and data analysts, and they look at all the corpus of information we have and try to develop trends that which product team can actually use, helpful insights that only you could really understand if you really dig really deep, that most people at the product level don't have the time or expertise to get into.
Oh, wow. All my big data friends would definitely be jealous about stuff that you guys have going on in metrics.
Yes. Well, we have, the common theme is that Netflix doesn't have enough data and StumbleUpon has way too much to make recommendations. So we have an overload of data, which is why our data science team is perhaps 5 people now. So it's a large team compared to a 60, 70 person organization.
And the as far as the conversion testing that you're doing, that's a system that you guys built yourself, and that's how it works, or is it using a third party?
So we're actually in a transition phase. We used to be heavily dependent on custom tools whenever like those tools weren't invented. Like StumbleUpon's been around for 10 years,
Right.
and so A/B testing wasn't something you outsourced 5 years ago because Optimizely and all these other tools really didn't exist. And if there was a software tool, it wasn't easy to use or it was very expensive. So we're in a transition phase where we're actually moving to more third-party tools because you have the maintenance problem, you have the tech debt problem, when you have all these custom tools.
Yep.
When you reach scale, like StumbleUpon is, we're at 30 million users and we serve about 40 million uniques a month, I believe. We're at a pretty large scale, but our team size is not doesn't reflect that. So having one engineer who's dedicated out of an engineering team of 40 to supporting, let's say, an internal A/B testing tool isn't the most effective use of resources when you could be paying somebody, let's say, the price of an engineer, but it never breaks or never fails. So when you're making a decision about custom tools, non-custom tools, generally there's a sort of delta of additional benefit that you are gaining for a custom tool. And like my recommendation to anybody is to consider that delta needs to be supported over a length of time and add in the deficit of tech debt. Having a custom tool, you need to have a support team readily available to continue to build on it and iterate and add new features, just like a third-party tool you're using. And a lot of companies that go the custom route are simply doing it because they can't give up that little delta of not having as much insight as they would like. But on one hand, lean analytics says that if you can't easily measure it, if it's not something that's readily intuitive, then it's probably not a good metric. There are circumstances where you measure too much and you actually can't get useful insights into your product.
I saw a great workshop by you in Miami, and you talked about startup metrics. Can you give some best practices to the average startup out there when they get started? What should they be tracking in order to measure growth? I know you can't go into the whole workshop, which is all about that, but just some summary of some of those takeaways.
The best metrics are the ones that are actionable, that are timely, and they come in very quickly. As a short feedback loop in our timeless. That over the course of a year, even though it's very timely, you actually can measure yourself and saying, I'm actually improving or not improving. Those are like sort of the top 3 qualities of metrics that I look for. And then so the secondary would be something like conversion rates are generally, in my opinion, better than aggregate numbers or nominal numbers, because conversion rate generally is efficiency or a percentage of effort that you're trying to expend to receive a gain, versus nominal, it's not as insightful. It's, to me, it can be just as actionable, but it's just not as insightful as a conversion rate. At the early stage level, when you're dealing with, let's say, your founder team of 30 people, you have a lot of advantages and disadvantages when it comes to analytics. One, you actually don't have a lot of things you actually can track because you can't actually be scientifically or statistically. I can't statistically prove the things I'm doing is valuable at such a low traffic level. So you should pick a metric that is something you can do 2 things with, that you could qualitatively prove you could quantitatively prove if you had the means to do so, as in more data, but you could qualitatively also support that is oriented towards your core business. So it would also depend on sort of your type of goals at the company. If you wanted to be a small business and orient yourself to like a no funding direction, then I would say support or have metrics that are oriented to monetization as fast as possible. But if you're going to an investor route and the VC route, they only care about generally one thing, which is growth. And so if you can prove growth, which is generally registrations, right, then then basically it's much easier for an investor to believe that in the future that you will possibly monetize. VCs and investors generally are looking for, at least for startups, are looking for a faster return. We're talking about 3 or 5 years versus small businesses 10 to 15. So that's why they're investing that's why the capital is so risky. And so that's why as startups, you also are risky as well. So You know, but a caveat to that is that focusing only on acquisition before your core product is actually a core product, and it actually is fitting somewhere within a market that can scale, then focusing on acquisition is not the best. I mean, you can invent a viral loop to where you get 6 million people, and you can probably some lower quality money on that premise. But their bet is not the your viral loop, because a viral loop is not a product; it's just a cycle that which people go through. So the best way to measure core product is generally like, one, determine the type of market that you're targeting and whether or not you're retaining those people properly. That's a key mistake that a lot of startups miss, is that they look at retention and they think it's positive, but they don't understand why it's positive. And you need to figure out what type of customer is staying, which ones are leaving, and then orient yourself in product development direction around that. But look at time on site is generally a good one when you don't have a lot of like strong where you don't have a lot of traffic. Overall retention is a good one. So you could just say how many people are coming back at a certain date and just make that sort of the binary if like it's retained or not retained. But when you're in such a small scale, it's not the best use of your time to try to develop A/B tests or some ways to simply improve your product. A lot of it's much more qualitative gut feeling, and you can use A/B tests to just sort of guide yourself, but you can't 100% fully rely on it, because it's not like you can run a test and it looks positive, but if you can't statistically prove it, and it's a p-value of less, less than like 15 or 10, which means you're 20% likely or 15% likely that you're gonna be wrong. I mean, it's not the best sort of conclusion. That's a pretty big margin. You want to be in the ranges of like 95%, like likely that it's false positive or something like that.
Right. Also, I think one of the things that I took away from your workshop was how you guys create this history of your tests and fall back to that. And also one thing you mentioned was your null hypothesis. Can you explain when you guys do a test for maybe you think you actually know it's going to lose, but you test it anyway?
Yeah, so whenever you run a test, you don't want to be proving that you're right. You want to be solving for the null, which is that you're wrong. And that's sort of how the core of the scientific method is to sort of try to be objective and biased. But you learn more from your failures than you do learnings. And so we often run tests that sort of like a lore in the company, or someone says like this is like the core thing that the product depends upon. And so you always want to have the habit of testing your riskiest assumption and at the product level. So just test it, and you may lose, but the thing you learn a ton. But don't go into an A/B test being like this thing is going to win, it's going to be 100% successful, because you'll be disappointed, because 80% of your tests will probably fail, 20% will probably be successful, but only be marginally successful. And of that 20%, maybe 5% will actually be outstanding. And the 5% is stuff that you're looking for. So now you got to go through a lot of muck to actually get there. And then you'll run into barriers as well, like where you'll start hitting the wall and not understand why. And solving for the null gives you just a little bit of more of like a step back, where you can say like what is the true reason why we're not succeeding.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you guys do that. So when your corporate guys come up to you and say, "Oh, we want to test this and that," do you just look in your book and say, "Oh, we've done this, we've done that," and they say, "Oh, why should we redo that?"
So I mean, that's definitely something we have looked in the past when we use it to inspire our next round of testing. We generally, I don't have the habit of saying no, because if you really adopt the lean and agile culture, or just lean culture, you're supposed to have the belief that no one ever says no, just everything is prioritized.
Right.
And it's based upon the evidence you bring to the table that this will be a good test, such as like if you want to like say alter the state of a page or button, you can basically show with some basic math being like, if I move this by 30%, what's the amount of ROI expected output I'm going to gain from doing that, that sort of stuff. But like tests that are done 2 years ago, a year ago, can not be super relevant anymore, especially because people's behaviors and attitudes on the internet changed a lot. But also you should consider that the most important factor is actually whether or not the user motivation is the same in every single scenario. So even though the tests may be similar, but the user motivation is different, it's very valid to say that we're going to run the same test again, but for a different set of people, and seeing if we can convert.
That's awesome. So we've touched on optimization, we've touched on testing, metrics, and if you have low traffic, maybe you shouldn't be testing. Is there any takeaways that we can conclude with as far as companies they've got their lead form, they essentially have their target audience. What's some good advice that you'd give to someone who's looking to grow their site basically from scratch?
So I would add caveat that it's not, so you should always be testing, but do qualitative testing if you don't have traffic, because you always should be testing something.
Sure.
Because you need to be validating your own view of the world, or the view of your product. So if you're a smaller company or a small startup and you have sort of your basic, you're trying to validate your product, there's two sort of strategies that you can take. One is you can slowly let distribution trickle to you, or two, and they can validate your product, or two, you can try to reach distribution with your messaging to test audiences and see if it resonates with them. So a simple thing would be like a landing page if you're targeting it to, let's say, moms who have 2 kids and something about daycare or something like that. You can pay a bunch of ads to funnel yourself to a landing page or see if people sign up to validate whether or not you are offering a product that's useful to people in your target audience. But two, now you have a base of customers you can start testing the core product on. So distribution, I would say, should only be used at an early stage to advance the product definition and product market fit phase. It shouldn't be I would say the primary focus, because when you're so early, you're sort of validating whether or not my customers will stay. You're in the discovery process. You're figuring out what's the core element of my product that's going to make me successful. And distribution can help you determine that, because it can get more people into the pipeline, get more data into the system where you can determine what features are most essential. So I recommend that distribution should be the mechanism used to validate your core product. But if you can, the level of diligence you apply a product market fit probably needs to be the same level of diligence you apply a product growth fit, because your distribution channels will, one, be more adaptive and change over time than your core product itself. You're talking about 1 to 2 years. A distribution channel that you relied upon may dry up and you need to develop something else. Typically, rapidly growing companies, they go in step functions. They don't really they don't go straight up. They go they reach up and they flatline a bit, and then they find something else and find something else. It's a layering effect. And so if you focus only on your core product after you find this one distribution channel or growth engine, as Eric Ries would say, you can get yourself in a rut to where 3 years down the road, you don't understand why you're growing at less than 1%, and you don't understand why. It's because just channels become saturated over time.
Sure. And
you just have to reinvent a channel, or find a new channel to grow your product.
Yeah, optimizing every single portion of that business. Not putting all your eggs in one basket, but just to really figuring out that secret sauce, and then not spreading yourself too thin either. Awesome, man. I definitely appreciate your time, and let's tell people how they can get in touch with you.
So you can follow me on Twitter. It's AGINNT, agent, or agent.com is my blog. I write about growth and product management, design, kind of whatever I'm thinking about at that moment. If you go to my blog, it has all of my other social profiles on there.
Awesome, man. I'll keep on stumbling.